Hello all, I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of the Sky News Daily, and not for the first time this summer, we're looking at the extreme life-threatening weather conditions currently being felt most significantly on the Greek island of Rhodes.
Everything is so dry, it's a tinderbox. The whole island's a tinderbox.
In fact, evacuation orders have been issued. 19,000 people have been forced to flee, thousands of them tourists, including Brits, desperately seeking a way home. Although this area of the Mediterranean often experiences wildfires at this time of year, the scientific consensus is that climate change is making their effects that much more dangerous. And yet, as we watch Rhodes burn, here in the UK, political parties, well, they're at least giving the impression that their commitment to environmental issues may be wavering. The Tories clung on in the recent by-election in Boris Johnson's former Oxbridge constituency, thanks in part to concerns about London Mayor Sadiq Khan's flagship environmental policy, the expansion of the ultra-low emissions zone. The Labour mayor and his party leader are now seemingly at odds, the received wisdom being that pursuing net zero isn't exactly a vote winner. Later, I'll be speaking to Robert Colvile, director of the Centre for Policy Studies and a former Conservative advisor, on whether that is in fact true. But we start with Rhodes itself, where the authorities are throwing the kitchen sink and its contents at the fires. Micah Greaves is a Brit who relocated there 8 years ago and who works and owns properties on the island.
It's not like any other fire that we've had before. It's not just a little fire. This is absolutely out of control. And it's engulfing villages now, as we're speaking now, into the village of Yanardi and Asciplio. These villages are now being burned as we are speaking. People are losing their homes, their livelihoods, their possessions. It's serious.
I mean, over the course of, the best part of a decade that you've been living on Rhodes, have you noticed the weather becoming more extreme? Have you noticed that the dangers posed by these summer wildfires increasing?
I think it was approximately 4 or 5 years ago we had the worst rains in living memory, and I think 1 or 2 people in Rhodes actually lost their life. We had bridges destroyed. This was crazy. This was biblical rain. And now the wildfires, people are saying that, the weather's hotter, everything's drier.
The reason that I'm asking that question is that, as I understand it, Rhodes is a part of the world that relies very, very heavily on tourism. And there will be people who have seen their holidays cancelled or who are having to be flown from the island on one of those repatriation flights, who look at the fact that over the past few years there have regularly been wildfires and are perhaps asking themselves, is Rhodes, in the medium to long term, feasible as a tourist destination?
Yeah, Rhodes, of course, it's feasible as a tourist destination. And I think after 2 bad years with COVID, I think that Rhodes now more than ever needs tourism. This economy is tourist-driven. We produce almost nothing on the island. The thought of tourists running away from this and going elsewhere, it would be catastrophic for the Greek economy and the tourism of Rhodes, for sure.
Has that thought crossed your mind? I imagine it must have, given that quite a bit of the work that you do must be directly related to the tourism industry.
I think 90% of the people on the island are working directly with tourism, and probably another 5% indirectly with tourism. If Rhodes loses tourism, then actually, a huge part of the population literally will have zero income, zero way of surviving. This cannot happen. It's as simple as that. This is the lifeblood of our island.
With the temperatures running regularly so close to and even above 40 degrees Celsius, with the wildfires that we're seeing this year and the predictions for even more catastrophic weather events in future, I'm just wondering, Micah, do you see yourself remaining on Rhodes long term, or have you considered the possibility of returning back to the UK?
I certainly have no intentions of returning to the UK anytime soon. I have considered the possibility of moving to the mainland of Greece. But no, at the moment, Rhodes is home, and I intend to keep it as my home. And I very much enjoy living here. I don't want to be driven out by wildfires or a lack of tourism or anything else, if possible.
Well, look, let's see how the situation is developing. Our Europe correspondent, Siobhan Robbins, is also on Rhodes. Siobhan, just describe exactly what you've been seeing.
It's a really desperate situation for many people living on Rhodes. We saw over the weekend the biggest evacuation of people due to fire that this island and Greece has ever had to carry out. And that is because a fire which had been burning from earlier in the week got whipped up by the winds, changed direction and headed towards popular resorts on the coast. And so we saw, for example, I spoke to people who had to walk for 11 kilometres with their kids along the sand. At one point, a lady I spoke to said she thought she was going to die and that she'd never see her children back home again. We've spoken to people who were told, keep going, the fire's coming. Every time they thought they got to somewhere safe, they were told it wasn't safe. Eventually, they had to get onto boats, which were at the coast, and that was the only way they could get brought to safety. Now, it's important to say the whole of Rhodes is not on fire. It's just a pocket. But last night, we actually had a lookout point, which was over the resorts, which were really badly affected by the fires when they changed direction on Saturday. And we could still see huge plumes of smoke being pumped from the centre of the island. We could see fires lighting on the hillside behind. And we're actually now heading today to a fire which has broken through the defences, because on Sunday they managed to knock those fires back and control them again in the centre of the island. Today it's broken back through the defences, back down near those resorts which we saw being evacuated.
Just give us an idea of the damage that you have seen that these wildfires have wrought, or have they largely been contained to those rural areas without major conurbations, without major build-ups?
Yeah, so definitely people are having two types of holidays. The people who were staying in a handful of resorts that were affected have had essentially 2 days, 3 days of nightmare where they've had to run from their hotels, grabbing what they can, getting on boats to get to safety. But then in Rhodes town, for example, this morning when we were driving through there, you'd have no idea that these fires were happening. People were enjoying their holidays. They were out on the beach. They were in the swimming pool. There are large portions of this island which are untouched. But I think the concern is that what lasting damage does this type of emergency have on the reputation of Rhodes? Will it put tourists off? Because the people here can't afford for that to happen.
Siobhan, when we talk about evacuation of so many people, there must be an imminent risk to life being posed by these wildfires.
This is an extremely dangerous situation, and it's a moving situation. So we already know from Saturday into Sunday, 19,000 people are evacuated. That number has continued to rise, and the temperatures aren't changing. This is the most intense and longest heat wave that Greece has ever experienced. And it's basically exacerbating annual forest fires. So they always have this problem with wildfires in the summer, but then the changing climate is feeding the issue. And so now we're seeing on islands like Rhodes, the biggest evacuation they've ever had to carry out because of fire. And that, of course, is absolutely devastating for local people who lose their homes and their businesses, but also for the island as a whole, because don't forget that this is an island that lives off tourism. And if people are sitting at home and thinking it's not safe to go to Rhodes, then they've got a big problem, particularly if this isn't a one-off. And actually, this is a situation which gets worse year on year. And I think that's why you've heard ministers within the Greek government talking quite candidly about the fact that they want people to come and have a good time, but they are the real-life victims of climate change.
Tell us just a little then about how the firefighters there are attempting to deal with the blaze. How do you tackle the best part of 100 wildfires burning across Greece in a coordinated fashion?
We look at Rhodes, for example, the fire that actually got out of control and burned towards the resorts on Saturday had been burning for 5 days before that happened. So the firefighters had managed to keep it in the mountainous area, which was basically unpopulated and away from villages. And they'd managed to do that successfully. But the problem was that then the winds whipped up, the winds changed, and the fire front got out of control. And they can do many things to try and stop that. So they'll drop, for example, from planes, liquid, which stops the vegetation from burning. They'll clear or set fires that burn in a controlled manner, vegetation, so that they can control where the fire's going and stop the big fire front from going in that direction. But ultimately, further, there's only so much they can do, particularly if those fires get out of control at night, because at night you can't send up the helicopters and you can't send up the planes, which are really important for both spotting and also fighting these fires.
How does it feel to stand looking at the countryside on fire in the way in which you and your team have been doing? You can smell it, I'm sure. You can taste it. You can certainly see it.
You just think two things. One, those poor people who have invested their whole lives into hotels and restaurants in those areas and now have had them destroyed or have lost their income because those areas aren't safe or people will fear that they can't go back. And then it's the tourists who some of them were just a day or two into their holidays with their kids, suddenly seeing smoke, ash on their balconies, grabbing what they could, leaving all of their possessions basically behind because all they could get was what they were wearing, bringing their kids from pillar to post, now sleeping on the floors of schools. I spoke to one man who was in a school. He actually flew out from the UK when the fires were already getting out of control on Saturday. He said his flight was delayed. They asked the holiday company, is it okay to go? They were reassured, yes, yes, yes. They finally got off the plane here in Rhodes, got put straight into a bus and driven to an evacuation shelter. So they have spent the last 2 days now sleeping on the floor of a school with no real running water, limited sanitation. You can imagine just how angry people are, and what makes them even more angry. It's not that the fires have happened. They understand it's a natural phenomenon that they can't control, the holiday companies can't control, but they feel there's been such a vacuum in information that they've just been left. One man said to me, the only people they've seen are the local reps who've done what they can. But in his words, he said they were basically sent out like sacrificial lambs.
But look, Siobhan, as you've already said, wildfires in this part of the world are nothing new. They are an annual occurrence. Yes, this is happening on a scale that we have not seen before. But isn't it the case that perhaps, tourists, British tourists, need to be mindful of the fact that there are risks when choosing to go to destinations such as this?
I think that's a really interesting debate, because ultimately, the more the world heats up, then the more destinations would become on a blacklist, because this isn't just Greece, which is affected by wildfires. We've seen wildfires breaking out across Europe in the last few weeks. And so I think that, yes, people need to be aware that wildfires break out when temperatures get out of control. But I think climate experts would say we all need to be aware that this is now the living evidence of how we are heating up the world, and this will continue to get worse. That's what every climate expert is saying now.
Thanks, Siobhan. All of which makes it even more curious that back here at home, our main political parties are seemingly backing away from their commitment to green policies, including the pursuit of net zero. More on that after this. Such is the devastation on Rhodes, and indeed other parts of the Mediterranean, that you'd expect it to prompt renewed discussion of our domestic commitment to tackling climate change. Yet instead, it's the result in the Oxbridge by-election that has led to the greatest wailing and gnashing of teeth amongst our politicians. And rather than doubling down on their environmental credentials, they are instead reviewing them. The Labour Mayor of London's decision to expand ULEZ, the ultra-low emission zone, is widely seen as responsible for the result, which saw the Conservatives hold the seat by less than 500 votes. Let's bring in Robert Colvile, director of the centre-right think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies. He also had a big hand in the 2019 Conservative Manifesto. Robert, good to see you again. Look, it is a rare day on the Sky News Daily podcast where we can take events on the island of Rhodes and combine them with events in the constituency of Uxbridge and South Ruislip. But that is what is going on right now, that while much of Europe is on fire at the moment, we are seeing the two main political parties, Labour and, of course, governing Conservatives, backing away from their environmental commitments. Are you in any way surprised by that?
The capacity for politicians to depress people is sort of near infinite. But what I am surprised by is the extent to which Uxbridge has been followed by a backlash, not just against the ULEZ policy, but against sort of greenery more generally. But I think what we're seeing now is this tension in politics, that everyone wants to save the planet. All the voters want to save the planet. Conservative voters want to save the planet, but no one wants to pay for it. So the moment that people get hit by charges or diktats that they think are unfair, that have hit them personally or hit people they know personally, they get upset. And that's what's happened with ULEZ. But I think quite a lot of people are trying to generalise out from that to a position that the voters are sick of all this. I'm not sure I can say the words on Sky, but all this green CRAP, as David Cameron used to call it. Both parties need to be a lot more hard-nosed about this. I don't think that's the case. I think what the public wants, as it always wants, is for the government to do all sorts of things on climate, none of which cost them any money.
And of course, if it is difficult at the best of times to get people in favour of environmental policies that hit them in the pocket, one has to assume that during the middle of a cost of living crisis, that problem doubles.
Yeah, I mean, ULEZ, it was kind of the worst possible time to introduce it. You're basically telling people who can't afford to buy a new car that they're going to have to pay £12.50 every day to drive their car. That's really, yes, ULEZ only affects a minority of people, but the people it affects are disproportionately women, people on low incomes, people who are living outside of central London and don't have access to all the hot and cold running tube stations and bus stops that you people do in the area where ULEZ has already been introduced.
Again, to return to the example of the pictures that we've been seeing from Rhodes and elsewhere, I mean, we are seeing, according to the scientists, extreme weather events with greater frequency and with greater potential for damage than ever before. And yet, at the same time, if we look domestically, particularly at the Just Stop Oil protests, you are beginning to see signs that public opinion is not uniformly positive, that this method of direct action being deployed by certain environmental groups is proving somewhat counterproductive.
Oh, completely. I saw some polling a couple of years ago which showed that even Greta Thunberg was effectively as polarizing as Nigel Farage, just in the opposite direction. The problem is that the environmental movement has been captured in a lot of areas by people whose actual blueprint is to switch off the modern economy. It's just stop It's not really just stop oil. It's just stop capitalism. And the argument that people like me have been making is, well, you're never going to be able to persuade people to give up a good life. People have legitimate aspirations to heat and light and cars and meat and TVs, all the things that we absolutely take for granted. Which is why, on the road to net zero, innovation and technology are going to be so absolutely crucial. Because the reason that we are having this enormous surge in wind power, solar power, electric vehicles, it isn't because governments have thrown billions of pounds at the problem. It's because these things are becoming massively cheaper and rapidly cheaper. And I think that is ultimately what will save us, as opposed to people throwing orange paint over portraits in the National Portrait Gallery.
So if we agree with the analysis, and personally I do, that people are pro-environmental policy up until the point at which it has a material disadvantage to the quality of their life, how do we flip that on its head? I mean, you've talked about incentivizing rather than punishing people on environmental policy. Just give us an example of that.
Well, so ULEZ is a really good example of that. We did a big report, our think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, did a big report on that quite recently. And what we found was that not only are people supportive of environmental measures, they're supportive of clean air zones. They're supportive of trying to make the air cleaner by getting people to drive less polluting cars. But what they feel is that as drivers, they've been absolutely sucked dry by the Treasury, and that all of this is treated just as another cash cow. And what you see in the ULEZ expansion is just awful comms and awful policy. You see, people not being told that this is about upgrading their vehicles, not being told this is about clean air. It's just like ULEZ is coming and you have to live with it. So the basic things are, if you're going to do something like this, make sure that people have alternative modes of transport, make sure that people can actually replace their cars. So that there's a combination of bravery, but also sensitivity, if you see what I mean. You are going to have to do some things that people don't like. But ultimately, people are not going to replace their boilers with heat pumps because the government tells them to. They're going to replace their boilers with heat pumps because it turns out to be cheaper to run their homes, or if we can get hydrogen heating working. Whatever the solution is, that's what's going to be what solves it, not government banning things and dictating to people.
But just in pure electoral terms then, politicians who maintain, on the basis of the result in Oxbridge and other by-election results, politicians who maintain that environmental policies are net vote losers, I mean, that's just not necessarily the case then.
Yeah, I was one of the people who co-wrote the Tory manifesto in 2019. It had a commitment to achieve net zero on the second page as one of the 5 core pledges, and they won a stonking majority. I banged on about wind farms and solar panels. There's this kind of weird myth in Westminster that everyone doesn't like them. The polling is overwhelmingly in favour. Even if you ask people really, really specific questions like, do you want a wind farm built right next to you? And if you then say to people, and by the way, if we build a wind farm, you can get some of the money back as money off your electricity bills, they become even more supportive.
Just to conclude then, in terms of Rishi Sunak and what we have learnt today from lobby briefing and elsewhere, that there is a commitment to net zero, but it seems a softening of that commitment to net zero. As one of the architects of the 2019 manifesto, do you agree with that position?
I think at a time of cost of living crisis, it's absolutely right to look at how people can be protected from cost of living increases. On energy, for example, I think we have actually been too focused on clean energy and not on energy abundance. We've done a really good job of decarbonising our energy supply, and that should and will continue. But we haven't built the capacity that we need to. So, we haven't built enough nuclear power stations. We haven't built enough of all kinds of power generation, really. So I think just a kind of narrow focus on decarbonisation is a bad idea, but a focus on, using these technologies, using these innovations to bring down costs for ordinary people is absolutely where politicians need to be.
And just to check, Robert, you haven't got any flights booked to Rhodes anytime soon, do you?
Alas, no.
Indeed.
Well, wonderfully no. I mean, probably not a very nice place to be at the moment, but no, Devon for me.
Well done. Keep it local. Robert Colvile, good to talk to you. My thanks to Robert, to Micah, to Siobhan, and of course to you for listening. That is your lot for today. We'll be back again tomorrow. See you then.